Chapter 1, The Awakening.
In the dimly lit basement of an abandoned warehouse, the stale air hung heavy with the scent of decay and neglect. Marcus Crane lay on a tattered cot, his fitful slumber disturbed by whispered voices that echoed off the damp, crumbling walls. Shadows danced across his face, casting grotesque shapes that seemed to mock his troubled dreams. As Marcus's eyelids fluttered open, he found himself bathed in the sickly glow of a flickering overhead bulb. His heart pounded in his chest, a sense of unease settling over him like a suffocating blanket. The memories came flooding back in a rush of adrenaline-fueled terror, each one more vivid and horrifying than the last. With trembling hands, Marcus pushed himself upright, the cold concrete floor sending a shiver down his spine. He glanced around the dimly lit chamber, his gaze drawn inexorably to the bloodstains that marred the ground beneath him. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a grim reminder of the unspeakable horrors that had transpired in this forsaken place. A chill wind whispered through the broken windows, carrying with it the distant sound of sirens wailing in the night. Marcus's pulse quickened at the familiar sound, a primal urge stirring within him like a slumbering beast awakening from its lair. He knew what he had to do, what he was compelled to do by forces beyond his control. Rising to his feet, Marcus stumbled towards the rusted metal door that stood sentinel at the top of a narrow staircase. Each step sent a jolt of anticipation coursing through his veins, his mind awash with visions of violence and carnage. He could taste the metallic tang of blood on his lips, feel the weight of his weapon in his hand as he prepared to unleash hell upon the unsuspecting world above. But even as he reached for the handle, a voice whispered in the recesses of his mind, a faint echo of the man he once was. It begged him to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But Marcus knew that he was beyond redemption. He was a slave to his darkest impulses, a puppet dancing on the strings of fate. With a final desperate gasp, Marcus flung open the door and stepped out into the night, his eyes ablaze with a madness that could not be quenched. The city awaited him, a sprawling labyrinth of dark alleyways and forgotten souls ripe for the taking. And as he disappeared into the shadows, a sinister smile twisted his lips, sealing his fate as the harbinger of death and despair.
In the heart of the city, Marcus prowled the streets like a predatory beast stalking its prey. His senses were alive with anticipation, every nerve tingling with the thrill of the hunt. Shadows clung to the alleyways like specters, concealing the dark deeds that lurked within their depths. With each passing moment, Marcus's resolve hardened, his mind consumed by a single, all-consuming desire. He hungered for the taste of fear, the rush of adrenaline that came with each kill. It was an addiction, a primal need that gnawed at his insides with insatiable hunger. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for the perfect target to satiate his cravings. It had to be someone worthy, someone who would ignite the flames of terror in their final moments. Marcus's lips curled into a feral grin as he caught sight of his prey, a lone figure stumbling drunkenly down the deserted street. With silent precision, Marcus closed the distance between them, his footsteps masked by the cacophony of the city at night. His heart pounded in his chest, a symphony of anticipation that drowned out all other noise. He could feel the heat of his victim's fear radiating off them like a beacon in the darkness, drawing him ever closer to the kill. And then, in a flurry of motion, Marcus struck, his blade slicing through the air with deadly accuracy. The sound of flesh meeting steel was music to his ears, a symphony of agony that echoed through the night. His victim's screams pierced the silence like a knife, fueling Marcus's bloodlust with each passing moment. But even as the life drained from his prey's eyes, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. There were more souls to claim, more lives to extinguish in the name of his twisted desires. And as he disappeared into the shadows once more, a savage hunger burned in his eyes, driving him ever onward in his relentless quest for blood. Chapter 2: The First Kill. The night was alive with a symphony of terror as Marcus stood over his first victim, their lifeless bodies sprawled out before him like a macabre offering to the gods of darkness. The metallic tang of blood hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of fear that permeated the alleyway. As Marcus gazed down at the lifeless form, a rush of euphoria washed over him, sending shivers of ecstasy coursing through his veins. It was a feeling unlike any he had ever experienced, a heady cocktail of power and dominance that left him intoxicated with the thrill of the kill. He reached out a trembling hand to caress the cooling flesh of his victim, reveling in the sensation of their life slipping away beneath his touch. The sight of their vacant eyes filled him with a perverse sense of satisfaction, a twisted reminder of the power he held over life and death. But even as Marcus basked in the aftermath of his first kill, a voice whispered in the back of his mind, a nagging doubt that threatened to shatter the illusion of invincibility he had constructed around himself. It begged him to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But Marcus knew that there was no going back now. With a cruel smile twisting his lips, Marcus turned away from the scene of his crime and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of devastation in his wake. The taste of blood lingered on his tongue, a tantalizing reminder of the darkness that lurked within his soul. And as he vanished into the shadows once more, a newfound sense of purpose burned in his eyes, driving him ever onward in his quest for carnage and chaos. By day, Marcus Crane was a master of disguise, hiding his true nature behind a mask of normalcy that fooled even those closest to him. He walked among his co-workers with a practiced smile, his every movement calculated to conceal the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. But behind closed doors, Marcus was a different man entirely, his mind consumed by visions of blood and violence. He spent his days in a haze of anticipation, counting down the hours until he could once again indulge in the thrill of the hunt. His co-workers knew him as a quiet and unassuming man, but Marcus knew that he was so much more than that. He was a predator, a wolf in sheep's clothing, prowling the corridors of his mundane existence in search of his next victim. And as he sat at his desk, surrounded by the trappings of normalcy, Marcus felt the familiar itch of restlessness gnawing at his insides. He longed to be out in the city streets, stalking his prey with cold, calculating precision. But for now, he would bide his time, content to wait until the cover of darkness once again cloaked him in its embrace. But even as Marcus buried himself in his work, a sense of unease gnawed right at the edges of his consciousness, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. He knew that he was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between sanity and madness with each passing day. And as he stole a glance at the clock, Marcus felt a thrill of anticipation course through his veins. The night was calling to him, beckoning him forth into the darkness where he belonged. And with a wicked smile curling his lips, Marcus rose from his desk and disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind the facade of normalcy in his wake. Chapter 3: The Cat and Mouse Game. As Marcus continued his reign of terror, a sense of unease settled over the city like a thick fog, choking the life out of its inhabitants. Detective Emily Hayes, a seasoned veteran of the force, was hot on his trail, her sharp mind piecing together the clues left behind at each crime scene. But Marcus was no ordinary killer, and he relished the game of cat and mouse that unfolded between them with each passing day. He taunted Detective Hayes with cryptic messages and clues, leaving behind a trail of carnage in his wake as he danced just out of her reach. For every lead she pursued, Marcus had already laid a trap, each one more diabolical than the last. He reveled in the thrill of the chase, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as he outwitted the authorities time and time again. But Detective Hayes was not so easily deterred. With each setback, her determination only grew stronger, her resolve unshakable in the face of Marcus's twisted machinations. She knew that she was closing in on him, that it was only a matter of time before she brought him to justice. And as Marcus watched from the shadows, a sense of anticipation coiled in the pit of his stomach. He knew that their final confrontation was inevitable, that one way or another, their fates were intertwined in a deadly game of survival. But for now, Marcus would continue to elude capture, reveling in the chaos and terror he left in his wake. The city was his playground, and Detective Hayes was merely another pawn in his game of death and destruction. And as the night stretched on, the two adversaries drew ever closer to their inevitable showdown, each one determined to emerge victorious in the end. With each kill, Marcus's rituals grew more elaborate, more grotesque. His lair became a twisted shrine to his own depravity, adorned with the trophies of his conquests. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, a sickly sweet perfume that clung to his skin like a second shadow. Every detail was meticulously planned, every movement deliberate and calculated. Marcus reveled in the agony of his victims, savoring every drop of blood spilled in his name. He danced among the corpses like a deranged maestro, conducting a symphony of suffering and despair. But it was not enough to simply take a life. No, Marcus demanded more. He craved the fear and the pain, the raw, unbridled terror that filled his victims' eyes as he snuffed out their lives without remorse. And so, he devised new ways to torment and torture, pushing the boundaries of human suffering to their limits and beyond. Each kill became a twisted performance, a macabre ballet of death that played out in the shadows of the night. But even as Marcus reveled in the chaos and carnage, a sense of emptiness gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. No matter how many lives he claimed, no matter how much blood he spilled, it was never enough to fill the void that consumed him from within. And as he stood amidst the wreckage of his latest masterpiece, Marcus knew that he was spiraling ever deeper into madness. But even as the darkness closed in around him, he could not deny the twisted ecstasy that pulsed through his veins with each beat of his blackened heart. Chapter 4: The Unraveling. Despite Marcus's best efforts to cover his tracks, cracks began to form in his carefully constructed facade. Detective Hayes closed in on him with relentless determination, uncovering evidence that painted a damning portrait of his crimes. Each new revelation sent shock waves through the city, shaking its inhabitants to their core. Marcus's reign of terror had left a trail of devastation in its wake, and now the authorities were closing in on him with every passing moment. But Marcus was not about to go down without a fight. As Detective Hayes tightened the noose around his neck, he lashed out with renewed ferocity, leaving a path of destruction in his wake. The city descended into chaos as Marcus's rampage reached its climax, leaving behind a trail of bodies in his wake. But even as the streets ran red with blood, Detective Hayes refused to back down, her determination unwavering in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the final showdown loomed on the horizon, Marcus knew that his time was running out. The walls were closing in around him, and there was nowhere left to run. But even as he faced the prospect of his own demise, a twisted grin curled his lips, for he knew that his legacy would live on long after he was gone. The city held its breath as the tension between Marcus and Detective Hayes reached its boiling point. It was a battle of wits and wills, a deadly game of cat and mouse that had gripped the entire metropolis in its icy embrace. For weeks, the two adversaries had danced around each other, each one determined to emerge victorious in the end. But now, as they stood face to face in the heart of the city, there could be no more running, no more hiding. It was time for the final showdown. Marcus's eyes burned with a feral intensity as he stared down the barrel of Detective Hayes' gun. He could feel the weight of her gaze bearing down on him, a silent accusation that cut through the darkness like a knife. But even as Marcus braced himself for the inevitable confrontation, a part of him reveled in the chaos that surrounded him. It was a feeling unlike any he had ever known, a heady mixture of fear and excitement that sent shivers down his spine. With a sudden burst of movement, Marcus lunged forward, his blade flashing in the dim light as he struck out at his adversary with deadly precision. But Detective Hayes was no stranger to violence, and she met his attack with a ferocity that took him by surprise. The two adversaries clashed in a whirlwind of steel and gunfire, their movements a blur of motion as they fought tooth and nail for supremacy. Blood flowed freely as blows were exchanged, each one driving them ever closer to the brink of oblivion. But even as the battle raged on, Marcus could sense the tide turning against him. His strength was waning, his resolve faltering in the face of Detective Hayes' relentless onslaught. He knew that he was fighting a losing battle, that his time was running out. And then, with a sudden burst of clarity, Marcus saw his opening. With a desperate lunge, he disarmed Detective Hayes and sent her sprawling to the ground, her gun skittering across the pavement out of reach. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as Marcus stood over his fallen adversary, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he surveyed the scene before him. But even as he raised his blade for the killing blow, a voice whispered in the back of his mind, a faint echo of the man he once was. It begged him to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But Marcus knew that he was beyond redemption. He was a slave to his darkest impulses, a puppet dancing on the strings of fate. And with a savage roar, Marcus brought down his blade, sealing Detective Hayes' fate in a whirlwind of violence and retribution. As her lifeblood pooled around her, staining the pavement crimson, Marcus felt a sense of grim satisfaction wash over him. But even as he stood over the body of his fallen adversary, Marcus knew that his victory was hollow, that the darkness that had consumed him would haunt him for all eternity. And as he disappeared into the night once more, a sense of emptiness settled over him like a shroud, a grim reminder of the price he had paid for his sins. Chapter 5: The Aftermath and the Legacy. The city held its breath in the aftermath of the final showdown between Marcus and Detective Hayes. The streets were silent, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread as the full extent of Marcus's reign of terror came to light. For weeks, the city had been gripped by fear, its inhabitants living in constant terror of the shadowy figure that stalked their streets. But now, with Marcus finally brought to justice, there was a collective sigh of relief as the specter of death that had hung over them was lifted. But the scars left behind by Marcus's rampage would never fully heal. Families mourned the loss of loved ones, their lives forever shattered by the senseless violence that had torn through their lives like a hurricane. Detective Hayes stood among the wreckage, her heart heavy with grief for the lives lost and the innocence stolen. But even as she grappled with the enormity of the tragedy that had unfolded, she knew that her work was far from over. There were still questions that needed answers, loose ends that needed tying up before the city could begin to heal. And as she sifted through the wreckage of Marcus's lair, she uncovered clues that painted a chilling portrait of the man behind the mask. But even as she closed in on the truth, Detective Hayes knew that there would always be another monster waiting in the shadows, another predator ready to prey on the innocent. It was a grim reality of life in the city, a constant battle against the darkness that lurked just beyond the surface of everyday life. And as she looked out over the city skyline, Detective Hayes vowed to continue the fight, to never give up in her quest for justice. For though Marcus may have met his end, his legacy would live on in the nightmares of those who had crossed his path. And as the sun set on another day, casting long shadows across the city streets, Detective Hayes knew that the darkness would always be waiting, lurking just out of sight, ready to consume the unwary in its endless hunger for blood and chaos. In the wake of Marcus's reign of terror, the city struggled to rebuild, its wounds still raw from the horrors that had unfolded in its streets. But even as life slowly returned to normal, the legacy of the serial killer lingered like a shadow, a grim reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the surface of everyday life. For those who had lost loved ones to Marcus's insatiable bloodlust, the pain was a constant companion, a gaping wound that refused to heal. They lived in fear of the night, haunted by the memories of the atrocities that had torn their lives apart. But even as they mourned their losses, they found solace in each other, in the knowledge that they were not alone in their grief. They banded together, united in their determination to honor the memories of those they had lost and to ensure that their voices were heard. And as the years passed, the city began to heal, its scars fading with each passing day. But the memory of Marcus Crane and the horrors he had unleashed upon the world would never fade, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones by those who dared to speak of the darkness that had once gripped their city. But even as the shadows lengthened and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a pall over the city once more, there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. For though Marcus may have left a trail of devastation in his wake, he had also sparked a fire within the hearts of those who had survived his rampage.
And as they stood together, united in their resolve to never forget, they knew that no matter what darkness may come, they would always be ready to face it head on, armed with the strength and courage born from the ashes of their darkest hour. And as they looked to the future with hope in their hearts, they knew that no matter what trials may come, they would face them together, a beacon of light shining bright in the face of adversity.